We have 4 distinguished panelists tonight. I'm very happy and appreciative for each of them being here. First off, Julie Budd. So Julie is Outreach and Volunteer Coordinator at CrossRoads Sexual Assault Response and Resource Center. Second, we have Rob Johnson. Rob is a retired senior resident Superior Court judge and former Alamance County District Attorney. Third, we have Lynn Rousseau. Lynn is Executive Director of Family Abuse Services. And we also have Angela Lewellyn Jones. Angela is Associate Dean of Elon College, the College of Arts and Sciences, and Associate Professor of Social Justice. She also hired me, so I think she's really cool.
Hired me too.
Thanks, Angela.
You're welcome.
So to begin with, I'll open one introductory question, and then we'll see what the audience has to say. So to begin, domestic violence. It's a big term. What is the scope of the term domestic violence? What types of behaviors does it entail? Is it just one form of behavior, or are there many forms of phenomena that fall under the umbrella of domestic violence? Anybody, feel free to take that.
I'll take a stab at it. So typically when we talk about domestic violence, we're talking about relationship violence, intimate partner violence. Sometimes nowadays in the literature, I see a few of my students in the audience, they know hey there, Allie, we throw around the term IPV in class, intimate partner violence. But we also talk about a bigger term called violence in families, which is a all-encompassing category that includes intimate partner violence, various types of child abuse, elder abuse, and sibling abuse. But typically when I think about domestic violence, I'm thinking more about intimate partner violence.
Any follow-ups to that?
Yeah, just in North Carolina, the state law defines domestic violence as more inclusive. It's sexual assault, child abuse, and intimate partner violence. We have separate agencies here in Alamance. CrossRoads deals with sexual assault cases. Family Abuse Services works with domestic violence or intimate partner cases, and then CrossRoads also does a lot of the work with the child abuse cases. But criminally, they're all considered domestic violence.
So many areas of social services are engaged in one form or another with domestic violence. It's not just one narrow thing. So there's a lot of room for questions here. I'll start out with one more question, and hopefully some audience members have some things they'd like to know from our panel, which is there a typical profile of victims or a standard profile of perpetrators of domestic violence?
There are some characteristics that we kind of look for in relationships of the batterer. Victims are kind of as unique as human beings because they're just humans, and there's no typical victim. A lot of times these relationships progress from a kind of healthy looking relationship, and then controlling starts, jealousy, and some things that are warning signs. But pretty much anybody can end up finding themselves in a victim of domestic violence. Unfortunately, it crosses educational levels, it crosses socioeconomic status. There isn't a typical victim. There are some things that we look for as far as the abusive partner, and that's being very controlling. We talk a lot about power and control, a lot about having all the control as far as finances and how the children are being raised, and a lot of the victims aren't allowed to work outside of the home or have friendships or relationships with their family of origin. They're isolated. So there are some behaviors that we look for in these relationships, but there's not necessarily. Now, obviously, if somebody grew up in a home, though, there's violence, they're probably at greater risk of becoming a victim as an adult.
I think you have to be careful about that, though, because the abusers, you really can't stereotype them any more than you can the victim. I remember growing up, my father used to say, no one really knows what goes on behind closed doors. And there's a lot of truth in that. The individual who's an abuser can appear outwardly to be your best friend, just the finest person in the neighborhood or in the town. So it's very difficult. Or an abuser can be someone who basically appears to be an introvert, but inside the confines of that domestic relationship, there's a different dynamic that goes on. So you have to be careful about that.
Follow-ups? All right, well, I'll ask a question that was submitted through the Times-News. We ask questions ahead of time in advance of these things. There are 2 interesting questions brought forward in this email, so I'll read it. I would like to know how we can stop the extensive delays in domestic violence criminal hearings. Continuances are allowed to go on for more than a year, and not only do witnesses and victims lose energy for this constant lengthening of process, it also gives significant ammunition to the defense when witnesses and victims cannot remember as clearly as so much time has passed. So it's more of a general question. I'll reframe that. Do we see things in our criminal justice system that in some ways impede the handling of domestic violence cases?
Defer to the judge on this one.
You're looking at me. That question could extend, in my estimation, to not only domestic violence cases, but a whole lot of other kind of cases. First of all, in the prosecution of any case, one of the greatest challenges that the district attorney faces is almost, it's like herding cats, trying to get everybody together in the courtroom at the same time, ready to go. And you would think that it would be relatively easy when you're not dealing with a very large type of case with a lot of witnesses, but it's invariably, the defense lawyer comes in and he's going to say, well, I just got hired or I just got appointed and I haven't had time to prepare. The prosecutor has the case on the docket. The prosecutor has not received a police report. If there was evidence that was sent for any kind of forensic analysis, it hasn't come back. And for those of you who may not be aware of this, our State Bureau of Investigation laboratory is hopelessly backlogged. I mean, we're talking about 2 years and more of backlogs. So you're sitting there and you want the forensic evidence, you need the forensic evidence, and yet you can't get a hold of it. A lot of these cases, there is no forensic evidence. But one party or the other will come in and ask for a continuance because a witness is not available, because they have another court conflict or whatever. There is one way to try to move it along a little bit, and that is saying a word which seems to be very hard to say this day and time, and that's no. When the motion for continuance is made, if the judge simply will say no, the motion is denied, that will move things along, but it might not move them along in the direction that it needs to go. If, for instance, if your witness is recanting, and in domestic violence cases, that is a huge problem. If your witness is recanting, is scared to death, will not testify, and as a judge I were to say no, a motion to continue is not allowed, it may be that that case then ends up being dismissed. And that may actually work an injustice as well. So there's no simple answer to that, but I think that the most important thing is if you have law enforcement agencies that have made a commitment to domestic violence, and a number of ours in this county have, if you have a prosecutor's office that has made a commitment to domestic violence, and our DA's office has, and not only through the current administration, we started that in my administration back in the 90s, and if you have police agencies that devote the resources to it, and everybody gets ready, at some point in time, the judge can say no continuance, and the case will move on. When that happens, it's amazing how many times there's a guilty plea as charged.
Tony, follow-ups?
I would just add that it's important. I think that the person who asked the question is hitting upon an important point, and the judge referred to it as well, that with the time delay that happens, understanding the cycle that these victims are experiencing and where they are in their cycle of the experience by the time that it does reach the court is oftentimes they're into the, what is called in the literature, Lenore Walker cycle of violence, the honeymoon phase, again, where the abuser has said, I'm so sorry, I promise I'll never do it again, I love you, I can't live without you, has given them gifts, and they're Prince Charming all over again. And that's why, in addition to being afraid of what could happen, but that's also why the victim's often saying, no, I don't want to go through with this now, because every victim I've ever talked to has said that despite the fact they're being abused, they still love the person.
And the other part to that is that might be the breadwinner for the family, and there's children that need to be fed and rent that needs to be paid, and so there might be those other additional barriers to the witness cooperating or testifying. But one of the things as a community, it is an issue that we need to look at and see if we can do a better job, because if we're going to really prevent future domestic violence incidents, we need to support the victim, but at the same time really hold the offender accountable for his behavior. We can't expect the victims to do that. They're not equipped, and it's just with the cycle that's going on, they're not able, and they shouldn't. It's not safe for them to try to hold their
And you hit on something very important there. The house payments being made by the person who's charged, the groceries are being bought by them, the health insurance coverage is that's where it comes from. So there's this dependency of the victim. And then there's other dynamics. But it is not at all unusual. Fact is, it's annoyingly common when the DA goes in and judge walks in on the bench, calls court to order, and DA starts calling the calendar, and he calls the name of the defendant who's charged with an assault. Sitting right there next to him, huddled up tight, is the prosecuting witness, is the named victim in the case. And you sit there and you look at that and you start thinking, uh-oh, we got a problem here. Now, what you don't know is whether that's because of I still love him, or whether it's because if you don't come to court and tell me that you want these, at the court that you want these charges dropped, you're going to find out what violence really is. So you don't know what the dynamic is. And one of the things that we have to try to do sometimes in a somewhat subtle sort of way is try to separate those folks so that you can actually find out what's going on, if you can find out what's going on.
And can I say one?
Absolutely.
I would just also add that as we're talking up here, I'm noticing that we're using pronouns and descriptors that are very much based in heterosexual relationships, and I just want to make sure everybody understands why. And that's because the data tells us that about 85% of the cases where domestic violence is occurring, it is a female victim with a male partner. But that 15% of them, approximately 15% of them, are male victims with female abusive partners. And then, of course, there are homosexual partner relationships where this is happening as well. But we know so little about that right now. There just hasn't been very much research done on that yet. So we're probably going to all slip into using the heterosexual normative language up here tonight, but don't hold that against us. We know that it can happen in other configurations.
The second Times-News question, and thank you for that, Andrew. The second Times-News question that is a good follow-up on that, which is that the person wrote, I would like to know how we can prosecute abusers when there is documented medical evidence of the assault, even if the witness will not testify.
Again, that's more of a judge's role question, but I will say that it used to be easier, if you had a good evidence-based investigation where the officer responds to the scene, takes pictures on site, takes pictures of the house with damage, and everything's done and documented, and he's interviewed witnesses. It was pretty easy to go ahead in those cases and try to prosecute it. And then there was Crawford, which changed. The police officer is not able to testify to what the victim told them unless the victim's there and willing and in the courtroom. So it makes that much more difficult for the prosecutors. But I still think making sure that you're doing strong evidence-based investigations would go a long way to trying to convince some people they should probably plead guilty.
Well, this kind of comes back to the buy-in that different stakeholders in the prosecution and in the investigation of these types of cases have with domestic violence. Now, it's interesting to me, and I was talking to Madison Taylor here before we started the night, and kind of relaying to him a conversation my wife and I had just yesterday, that there's a lot of discussion now about domestic violence as if this is something that has just come to light and it's a new thing. It's not. The Violence Against Women Act passed Congress, if I recall, I think it was 94 or 95, it was in the mid-90s. And out of the Violence Against Women Act, Congress actually appropriated some grants for the formation of a domestic violence task force and types of things. And back in the 90s, we really got started with the movement of developing evidence-based prosecutions. What that entails is there's a call, there's a response, the police respond. Now, there was a time, and I started in '73 practicing law, and I remember this time, and it went on for many years, where there were domestic cases, and the reaction of everybody was, oh, it's just another domestic. And I've heard defense lawyers, I've heard judges, I've heard prosecutors, I heard police officers all say that, and say things like, you know, it takes two to tango, and there's nothing to this, and the cases were kind of pushed aside. Well, that didn't mean it was right. It just meant that that's kind of how it was. But all that began to change back in the, well, at least 20 years ago. And when Congress enacted the Violence Against Women Act, that really was a major step forward, because the National District Attorneys Association adopted domestic violence as a major and critical project. And there were nationwide meetings attended by hundreds, and actually one was in New Orleans where some of us in this room attended, and there were over 2,000 of us there. And the training was to try to get different agencies to buy in. So let's say now there's a domestic call that comes in. The dispatcher contacts the agency, dispatches them. The officers go out, and if they have been trained in domestic violence, when they go out, they know certain things to listen for and certain things to look for. So they get out and they start talking, and you try to get the parties separated. You start looking to see if there are any injuries. You start looking to see if there's any turned over furniture, if there's anything indicative of a fight or something disturbed in the room, whatever. You try to get the photographs. And you don't stop there. If the victim has been pummeled and hit, you might take photographs, but you're not going to see bruises just then. You want to make sure you get that victim back in about 3 days' time, because the bruising is going to show up then, and you want to get new photographs. You start listening for things that they might be saying, because evidence-based prosecution, even with Crawford, you still listen for certain keywords. You might have excited utterances by one party or the other, which are admissible as exceptions to the hearsay rule in court. But you have to build the cases using the various tools that you have. In order to do that, you've got to have skilled investigators who can document that evidence. You have to have skilled prosecutors who know how to use that kind of information. And then it has to be presented in an understandable way in a courtroom. That's how you do it. You're not always successful. You're not always going to be able to do it in every case, but that's what you try to do.
And that takes substantial government resources.
It takes substantial resources. It takes a lot of training. And it takes a lot of buy-in by the stakeholders. And here in this county, we've been fortunate to do that
Well, thank you.
some time.
We have a question from the audience.
Hi, my name's Robin Winteringham, and I have a question it kind of came into my mind based on something Lynn said. When you talk about the community holding the offenders accountable, when I think about that, I think, well, of course, if they're convicted, there's jail time. What else is expected of an offender? I mean, is it anger management? Is it clinical training? Is it psychiatry? And based on your experience, are those things helpful to return with offenders? Or, I'm just curious, I mean, because how as a community, other than having them incarcerated, should we expect to hold them? Of course, I want them held accountable. I have many girlfriends who've been in this situation. And again, I'm deferring to the norm because that's what I'm familiar with. But how do you hold them accountable, and what should we expect, and what should we expect, this sounds bad, their punishment to be? How does that work?
Well, anger management is not an answer for domestic violence. These perpetrators are perfectly able to control their anger with their bosses and with their neighbors and with people that they are not trying to exert power and control over. This is tactical behavior. They are making decisions to use violence to control another person. It's not anger management, and it's actually really dangerous to send somebody to anger management. I actually had a victim killed right after her abuser completed in anger management way back when I started doing this. There is a batterers intervention program that was developed in Duluth. We have that here. A lot of first-time cases, they'll get referred to a batterers intervention. It's a 24-week program. Is it effective? It depends on the person who's going. For some people, it is very effective. For other people, if you've got somebody that's bound and determined they're going to control this person regardless of what you do, I'll go to jail, I'll do whatever, then it's not going to work. It's a quality program, but you have to have somebody that's actually invested in changing their behavior. And holding them accountable, a lot of that is, trying to prosecute these cases, even when the victim objects, even when she's afraid that she's going to lose her apartment, or, as a community, we have to step up and support that person, because it's not up to the victim to hold them accountable. We're setting her up for failure, and we're setting her up for danger if we do that. We really have to say as a community, we're not going to accept this. If you see your neighbor doing it, you're going to call police. If you see somebody being harassed on the street, you're going to say something and try to step in and help that person. It really is, and a part of the national movement now is really trying to get our male partners on board with us. There's the UN is doing a He for She campaign in a lot of college campuses. There's actually a toolkit online if anybody wanted to do that here. But it's just really kind of stepping up. You've got a sister, you've got a mother, you've got a girlfriend. This is important to you too, even though you're not a female. It's not just a women's issue. It's our whole community's issue. It costs tons of money in healthcare and lost wages and police time. It affects all of us. It's not just that victim, and it's not just a women's issue, and we've got to stop looking at it as this is just a women's issue. It's got to become our whole community's issue.
Angela, I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you know of any sort of scholarly research on these non-jail-based programs?
There isn't a lot, but what I've seen, I had a classmate in graduate school who did his dissertation research on a domestic offender sentence to education program that was down in Wake County. And his research found that it wasn't particularly effective for the reasons that Lynn was saying. These offenders who are very much invested in having total power and control, if they're sentenced by the judge to go and do that, then that's a box they have to check off to just get out of the purview of the court, right? So they'll go through the motions, but then it's back to business as usual, unless they're invested in, I really want to make a change and I want to save my family and, that sort of thing. But they have to feel like their victim, their partner, has the support to leave and go elsewhere in order to want to make that change, I think. The point that Lynn was making about all of us being invested in the community, I think, is a really important one. And I have my students in a class that I teach here at the university called Violence in Families. They do academic service learning with family abuse services and help the community educator at FAS take a mentoring violence prevention program out into the high schools all across the county, the Alamance Burlington School District. And they went to 7 out of the 8 high schools this fall and did the MVP program to all of the 9th grade health classes. And the program is really about teaching the young people how to be strong leaders and how to speak up when they see something or hear something that they find problematic, and feeling comfortable standing up and saying, wait a minute, I'm not okay with that. It's sort of like what some of us at Elon went through a training where we learned to say ouch when we found something offensive on campus, because if you just get people to stop and think for a moment, they'll go, oops, wait a minute, that's not really what I meant to say, right? And so we teach the 9th graders not to put themselves in a dangerous situation, but have the confidence not to stand back and just watch something or listen to something happen. Go find a teacher, go find a principal, do something to intervene. And they all have cell phones. So if nothing else, they could just pull out their cell phone and dial 911, right? So we just remind them that they have their cell phones in their pockets and they can do something to change this. But one of the questions we ask them is, don't you all have moms or sisters or aunts or cousins or good friends that are female that you would never want that to happen to them, right? And they all say, yes, of course, right? So it seems to help quite a bit.
We have a question submitted via card, so just as a reminder, if you'd like a question asked but you don't want to ask it on the microphone, you can write down the question on the card, someone will pick it up, and then we'll ask that question.
I have 2 questions submitted
Okay.
by audience members. The first question has 2 parts. It's how do you think the media affects the public's perceptions of domestic violence? Additionally, how do you think the media affects victims of domestic violence as well as their abusers? This question was submitted by Isabel and Cravati.
I think that the media can create images up on the big screen or the small screen that you have at home that encourage domestic violence or that help educate us about how to stop domestic violence. But a researcher who's done a lot of work on masculinity and the relationship between masculinity and violence, Jackson Katz, he came to Elon several years back. He has a few great documentaries where he talks about the tough guys, G-U-I-S-E, that men experience and try to live up to, and how that is just perpetuated. It's ubiquitous throughout the media, right? Everything from Rocky to Sylvester Stallone and everyone else. And I'm dating myself by using those examples. But I'm sure you can think of some that are more, Tosh.0, right? The kind of stuff that you see on that at night the few times that I've dared to take it in just so I could talk to my students. It's scary stuff, right? The imagery that's put out there about the objectification of women and the proprietary nature with which men pursue women. And so I think it does a lot to really damage what could be done. Now, could we flip that around and use the media to our advantage to spread a much more positive and useful message? Absolutely. And the reason why we tend to think this is a new phenomenon is because every time somebody really big and famous, like Ray Rice, or back decades ago, O.J. Simpson, right? When those things happened, it was like, whoa, that happens out there? Holy cow, right? And a lot of people are sitting back going, that happens all the time, right? But it's when somebody big and famous and it happens, we go, wait a minute, now we need to pay attention, right? And then it'll wear off and we won't think about it for a while.
There is benefits, like the Ray Rice case. There was definitely a ton of national exposure on the issue, which the more education and community awareness you get, the better. The flip side of that is the first night that the video broke and I was flipping through news commentators, and I'm listening over and over to, well, she married him anyways, she must like it. Those from the commentators, blaming the victim, not knowing anything about the dynamics of domestic violence. And even the way homicides are reported for DV cases on the headlines, a lot of the times they're not called, it's a violent homicide. And it'll be a battered wife, or it's not reported with as much, it's still in the media seen as a family issue, and it's not. This is what it is. It's domestic violence. It was a fatality. It was a homicide. It was a brutal murder. Call it what it was, and they don't sometimes. So.
And interestingly enough, nationwide, about 50% of all homicides are domestic, which is a staggering figure if you think about it. But the question used the word media, and media is a very broad term. So you were talking about the media in terms of pop culture and that type of thing. But we have the media in terms of the news media. To have something like the Ray Rice video is highly unusual, and I'm sure that that's part of what prompted the rise of this discussion again. But the media, the news media, the legitimate news media, bringing attention to that kind of thing can have a positive effect. Then you have media. We have the newspaper editor here tonight, and the news media and the print media can be very useful in kind of getting the word out about some of the issues and the problems. You had a media here tonight. We're recording this. So media can be a tool that has a constructive purpose, or it can be kind of a very destructive kind of thing when basically it's trying to promote an image. Interestingly, the image of a tough guy as, being someone who would be violent prone and beating up on women and all that, that's not always been the image of what it was to be a tough guy. I mean, I'm 66, getting close to 67. When I was growing up, the image of being a tough guy was you didn't lay a hand on a woman. Wasn't anybody going to beat up your sister? Wasn't anybody going to beat up your mama? It was considered to be unmanly. So in that aspect, media can have some bearing on, would you call it developing minds, maybe?
We'll move back to the left and then to the right to ask your questions.
So I just want to comment, there's a fair amount of evidence that substantiates that holding the offender accountable really does have an impact. So we're always working on victim services, and Alamance County has lots to be proud of when it comes to victim services. And I'm pretty convinced a game changer for us is going to be holding the offender accountable. So there's a program at High Point that holds the offender accountable, and they meet the offender at their first appearance in the jail and say, we are watching you. This is not acceptable. There's also a fair amount of evidence from the Duluth Model that shows that if a first-time abuser spends a night in jail, that decreases the likelihood for a certain percentage of people that they will do that again.
Sort of a wake-up
So that's the other piece that really needs to be addressed, that everybody's just beginning to recognize that will have an impact on this.
Joe, any follow-ups?
And I wanted to follow up on what Cindy said about Alamance County really being progressive in a lot of ways in comparison to other communities. We're the pilot in the state. We have the first electronic protective order system in the country. The victim comes to see us at the Family Justice Center. It used to be she had to run all over town to get an order. Every one of those trips was another barrier in another place that it might be easy to just change your mind. And plus it was confusing. I would go with victims and it was scary. I had an abuser follow us down the streets of Graham because he knew she was filing. And it's trying to find a judge and flag down a bailiff. And I worked in the court systems my whole career, and it's hard. Now the victim comes to see us, meets with an advocate, everything's filled out electronically, the clerk logs it in electronically, the judge meets with the victim over a video conference, we print it off right there, they don't have to go anywhere. And that's because of the commitment this community has to working on domestic violence. We have a statewide pilot for the Volunteer Court Navigator program where we match volunteers to go to court with victims, so they don't have to, you go into the courtroom and either it's criminal or in a civil for your protective order hearing, and the victim would be sitting by themselves because they were isolated, and the batterer would come in with his whole family, and again, the he/she. But we've got volunteers trained to just be present with the victim, to answer any questions they might have, just to make them, they'll meet across the street at the coffee house so they're not having to walk through security by themselves. It just gives that added level of support here that's really been successful in reducing the amount of protective orders that are dropped. The VACA is a Victim Advocacy Council of Alamance, meets monthly. It's all the direct services people get together trying to look at what we're doing right, what we could be doing better, and part of it is looking at going to model the High Point offender program, because they've had some really good success with that. We're also expanding on the volunteer program to have all the officers, and we're piloting in Burlington, and then it'll spread to the other departments, but do a quick lethality assessment with a victim on site, and if it's determined that the victim's at high risk of serious injury or death, the officer's going to call one of those volunteers and let the victim talk to an advocate right there on site, on scene. And this is modeled after a nationwide program, and it's been really successful in the amount of victims that actually follow up and meet with an advocate after the scene, and not when services are back open on Monday and they come in and get the help and services they need. So there's a lot of good work being done here, but we've got some obstacles still.
Yeah, I would echo what Cindy was saying. We do have so many services for victims, like at CrossRoads, we meet sexual assault victims at the hospital and go or with them through the whole SANE exam, and sometimes that can take 6 hours or 8 hours. It's quite intensive, as well as we have a 24-hour crisis line that gets many phone calls and of victims that are immediate happenings, or somebody that has trouble sleeping in the middle of the night and they are reaching out because they're still dealing with their violence. But what we aren't all that great about doing, and why I was so excited about this panel, is what's the next step? Like I said, we're spending so much energy and needed energy supporting the victim. There's that's what we need to be doing. And there's a lot of good work being done and a lot of benefits to doing that. But our next step is really holding the offender accountable.
Question on the audience's left.
Yeah, so earlier the panel was discussing abusers that go through programs to prevent future battery. I'm wondering, like, what percentage of people who actually go through those programs make that change? Is there any research on that, or is it close to zero?
No, it's not close to zero, and I don't know that. There has been some research based on the Duluth Model, and I don't know that percentage off the top of my head. I do know, if it's somebody that has a motivation to change, that'll probably be successful. They probably won't have a reoccurrence. If it's somebody who's just going because the court had said they had to and they need to get off probation, then that's probably not going to work. But I'm not sure what that statistic is. Sorry.
Well, I think we're at risk for when we look at that Duluth model, or have a offender go through a process like that, because I actually had filed a domestic criminal trespass against my former husband, and he did go through that training, but then I felt like it made him a smarter criminal, because they're really trying to make sure that they don't reoffend, so that I think they're really clear about how you can charge somebody with assault. So in fact, he ended up charging me with assault when I was at a soccer game, had a 4-year-old on my lap. I was on the ground, and the magistrate wrote it up as pushing his arms away. That was because when he came to grab my son out of my lap, I did this. And he knew from the offender program, oh, she raised her hands, we can charge her with assault. Now, it eventually got thrown out, because even the judge was like, were you afraid of her? And he was like, no, I wasn't. And so obviously it was not assault, but because of that lengthy process of being, it gave him extra time to think about, how to scheme the system. So I would have loved to have gone through, a similar, training to know. And there at the time, there wasn't anything available. This was many years ago. So I do think that we have to be careful about what information we're providing our offenders.
Another question on the left.
So my question kind of comes from the perspective of a college student, as I know many of our audience members are part of Elon's student body. Does relationship violence look different on college campuses?
Characteristics, not really. I mean, it's still power and control. It's different because there's not a lot of the people that we work with at the agency that they've been married or they have children in common. So you don't have all of that extra stuff that goes on in intimate relationships. But as far as the cycle and the power and control and the tactics and the jealous controlling, you're texting you 3,000 times a day, wanting to know where you are and what you're doing. That's similar, but it is different. And
we also see from the sexual assault side, the more of the acquaintance rape, and that's where, like Lynn was saying, we work closely together because some of our clients overlap, but then we also too have a lot that don't have as far as sexual violence, that don't have all the properties of a domestic violence, because the relationship is so new. It might be somebody that to me met at a party that night, so they're not having all those control and abuse kind of factors in the sexual violence. So there's a lot of conversation about sexual violence on campus, and hopefully we can keep continuing it. And it has some characteristics of the domestic violence, but when you look at a domestic violence case being, an actual longer-term relationship. There are some different nuances.
Becca, did either of y'all want to take that question about differences on college campuses? If you'd introduce yourself as well.
I'm Becca Bishop-Patterson, Coordinator for Health Promotion here at Elon. And so just as a follow-up, we see some differences with college students. It's still, like Lynn and Julie said, the cycle of power and control, but it looks a little different when someone isn't living with their abuser, right? It is the texting over and over again, or I want to walk you to every class every day, right? Or if you do this, or you do this for me if you really loved me, right? So those are the types of things that we hear more from a college population. Thank you.
I did want to mention, you have the 800 number now, the toll-free number.
I'm Jessica Clark. I'm the coordinator for violence response here at Elon Confidential Services. We have a 24/7 safe line for Elon University community members, and that is 336-278-3333. And that is, like I said, 24/7. It's confidential. It's a great place if you've got questions or concerns for yourself, for someone you care about. It's confidential. I want to drive that home. You won't be pushed to do anything you don't want to, but you can find information so that you can decide for yourself what's the next step for you, or how to give information to your friend or someone you care about.
So it's 336-278-3333.
And we work close with Jess and Becca with students that come. They are more of an expert about what's going on here on campus and what your situation might be. And then if you need a protective order, if it's deemed that you need safety planning and additional services, they'll bring the student out to us and we'll work together with victims. And that relationship has been great. And I was really excited about the hotline because most campuses don't have that. You guys are really lucky.
I think the audience member on the left was first stood up, and then we'll move to the right.
So obviously tertiary intervention and prosecution is something that's really important, especially when holding the offender accountable, but especially because we can't blame domestic violence on anger management and it is intentional behavior. What kind of primary intervention and prevention programs can we implement in communities, especially here at Elon, because I feel like that's where the real answer lies, and I know that maybe that's an impossible question. But
No, our agency is committed, and the bad thing is there's very little funding that you can get for primary prevention because it's really hard to show outcomes. We do third grade puppet shows in all of the schools across Alamance County to kind of start that healthy relationship and to show them some things that aren't so healthy, and that way we get a lot of CPS reports out of that program, and I know CrossRoads gets a lot of referrals out of that program. We also do an 8th grade program about dating violence, and then the 9th grade program that we do in conjunction with Angela's class. On campus, that he for she program, that there's a whole toolkit that campuses can use, and it's all just laid out there for you, and really trying to start engaging our young men. I think that would be hugely powerful for the college community and for the community at large.
Could y'all clarify what you mean by primary, secondary, tertiary for those in the audience?
Go ahead, no.
Please.
So,
we have very well-informed students.
primary intervention would be when you're intervening before the act happens and before the issue occurs, and then tertiary would be after the act happens, or
to try to prevent a reoccurrence or recidivism. So
it just happens that primary intervention in that case was in a primary school.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And community education is also considered primary. So this is a primary prevention program.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Susan Evans, and I'm with CrossRoads as well, and I would be remiss if I did not ask the panel to address just the trauma that children that are growing up in these environments are facing.
Yeah, and those are our unheard from victims. Unfortunately, a lot of the times we'll have victims come in and they'll tell us, oh, the kids were upstairs in bed, they didn't hear anything. If there's violence going on in that house, that child is fully aware of what's going on. It's really hard to get at those kids. We have started working closer with the school system through the Family Justice Center. Anytime we have a protective order when there's children listed, Sherry O'Shields, who's in the audience here somewhere, will send the school social worker a copy of that protective order with the allegations of abuse, and the other part that goes into those orders is if whether or not the kids were present, if the kids were harmed, is there any risk to the children? At least that way the student support teams are aware that something's going on in this kid's house and they can at least start to touch base. We've had a couple of cases that we've referred to CrossRoads where the violence was just so egregious. And the children were hurt during the incident that we've referred them to CrossRoads for therapy services and some more support services that that's more their specialty than ours. But no, and then that trauma, not only are they more likely to grow up and end up in a violent relationship, but they'll start acting out at school, start running away, drug use, promiscuity, all of the things that you see happen with child abuse victims, we see with kids who are in homes with domestic violence. And it's a huge, that if we're going to stop this from going to the next generation, those are the kids we need to be targeting.
Early and often.
Early and often.
Early and often intervention with these kids, because there is a very strong, powerful correlation with intergenerational transmission of the violence.
If I had my way, we would have healthy relationship training in preschool.
We have another question submitted by the audience.
Yes, this question was submitted by Tammy Cobb, Assistant Director of Community Partnership. And the question is, what specific volunteer roles are available in your agencies and do each require training?
There are several different volunteer opportunities with my agency. That volunteer navigator program that I talked about, there's a significant training component to that program, and there's also a time commitment where you have to be available all day on Mondays because that's when domestic violence court for the protective orders is. So that hasn't really worked out well for too many students. We have a strong relationship with the school as an intern placement. We have one right now, actually. Two. I have two. And also there's a shelter. We have an emergency shelter located off-site of the Family Justice Center. A lot of our students like to volunteer out there. We need child care assistance every Tuesday and Wednesday night because we have support groups. And if somebody wanted to volunteer on a longer term basis, more than a semester, you would get trained just like staff, and they could do eventually you would be doing safety planning and crisis services, one-on-one advocacy with victims. It just depends on what your niche is. If somebody wanted to do some programming with the kids, we make that happen too. So it's based on the volunteers' interests.
And the Conradle Center at Elon is a good resource for students interested in finding an organization like this to get involved with.
Yeah, and we have many volunteer opportunities at CrossRoads. We've got intern opportunities for students that are looking for internships. But with our 24-hour crisis line, we have 12-hour shifts available from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. and 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. as far as we transfer the crisis line to the student's phone, and we do have an extensive training program prior to being on that crisis team because those are the first responders. So we have to make sure that those volunteers are prepared for whatever happens. We do suicide prevention training. We go to the hospital and look at what that's going to look like for the victim as far as, and we go to law enforcement, a lot of training around listening skills and helping that victim find those resources that they might have within their own families or within their community to make good decisions, because we've talked about that domestic violence and sexual violence is about power and control. So whenever we interact with victims we and survivors, we need to make sure that we're providing some options but not taking away control, that we're letting them make decisions about what's going to happen next, and that's really huge.
Question from my colleague at the mic.
Sure. Excuse me. Phil Miller. Appreciate the work you do, Lynn, the family abuse, and Julie with CrossRoads. You guys rock. Offer some good services. Actually, as the longer I stood here, I think some of my questions have been answered. But I was just going to say, as far as the community campus with the students, how can the students be more or be involved in part of the solution? I know if you take Angela's class or you do an intern, that's part of the solution. But I guess beyond that, campus-wide, how can the students be part of the solution?
I may defer to one of those two ladies sitting behind you. There is a lot of activity on campus already dealing with this issue.
Hi again. So there are a lot of opportunities for students to get involved on campus. We have a peer education organization called Sparks, which offers programming on healthy relationships, active bystander, sexual assault prevention. And so certainly getting in touch with some of our peer educators. We have some here, if y'all stand up just so that people know that they can come to y'all. Sorry to put you on the spot. Thank you. And we also have a lot of awareness campaigns, one that we're working on with CrossRoads right now, as well as different events throughout the year. We do a Consent is Sexy campaign. We just did an event with Family Abuse Services a couple weeks ago called Strides for Safe Relationships with AKO. I think we have some of those women here. Yay. Thank you. And so certainly if you want to get involved, talking to one of these wonderful individuals up front, or myself or Jess Clark, and we can get you hooked in. We're trying to do a lot of programming. I know SGA is doing an It's On Us program this coming spring, which is the new campaign out of the White House, and I think we're also looking at the He for She. So if you want to get involved, there's plenty of opportunities, and please don't hesitate to contact us.
We're fortunate to have representatives here from both Alamance Sheriff's Office and Burlington Police Department. I wanted to give each of you an opportunity, if you have any information you'd like to convey to the audience, to the community, about what we should know from your perspective as law enforcement officials.
My name is Detective Carlos Rossi with the Sheriff's Department. I work in the domestic violence unit. I've been doing it for probably 5 months. It's a really great program that they have in the Family Justice Center. What we've seen as a law enforcement is that most of the time the victim is afraid. They don't want to talk. Most of the time we get refers by friends, family members, and we're trying to follow up with it. My main thing is that I want you all to know that the Burlington PD and Sheriff's Department have a domestic violence unit. If you ever got any issue that is not being solved by a patrol officer, you can always talk to detective in either agency, and they will be able to give you a better answer. Some of the problems that we've been seeing is that the training is not, for all the officers, is not the same. The domestic violence officers, they're being trained to identify most of the problems of domestic violence. So again, if you guys have got any questions or anything like that, you're more than welcome to contact any of the agencies, either Burlington or the Sheriff's Department. I'm pretty sure the Elon PD will have the program itself, but again, if you not got a right answer, I'm pretty sure that we can. But as a law enforcement, what we look out to see is that you have to tell us. You have to talk to us. It's hard for us to prosecute. It's hard for us to get these offenders to put it in front of the judge if we don't know. Again, you have the power to come to us and let us know what's going on. If you don't want to do it, you always have somebody else that can speak for you. But mainly, that's what the main thing that we're gonna tell to everybody is, we need to know. And that's, I mean, resources, again, they already told you that what they can do in the Family Justice Center, that's a great resource. But as a law enforcement point of view, again, we need to know. And if we don't know, we'll not be able to help you out.
Thank you. Detective Matherly.
Hi, I'm Detective Jennifer Matherly. I'm with Burlington Police Department Special Victims Unit. I just wanted to say that Burlington does recognize that domestic violence is a very serious crime. It is going to take a direct intervention for police as well as a community response. And to kind of piggyback on what's already been commented on tonight, part of the community response is some of the services that are offered in Alamance County that are available through CrossRoads and the Family Justice Center. But the other aspect of it is, again, holding the offender accountable. And the way that the community does that is doing just what Carlos was saying, which is stepping up. It's not uncommon for there to be witnesses to domestic violence. Not every domestic violence incident is going to involve a brutal attack that is physical in nature where injuries are apparent and we're going to be able to take photographs right then. Some things come with time. You may see something as a witness that doesn't seem that important to you at the time, that you don't report to us, which is very informative when trying to build a case on domestic violence that's not centered around the actual physical abuse. There are things like the texting, like Facebook, which is most commonly used for stalking in domestic violence cases right now. And you see this, you're friends with your friends on Facebook. You see these posts happening, you see what comments are being made. That information is not getting to law enforcement. If it's deleted and it's not brought to our attention at that time because so many people don't want to get involved, don't want to play a part in it, or remain silent, then you're really feeding into what the offender is doing in the first place. So I really think it's important that we focus on basically everything that everybody was saying tonight, kind of wrapped up in a bow, which is the only way to hold the offender accountable and the only way to have a community-oriented response to domestic violence is for everybody to step up and take some kind of action. You know, law enforcement officers do what they can at the time with the information that they have, but it's one of 65 cases on their desk that day. And for you, it may be the most important thing you saw that day or witnessed or most important thing that's going on for you, and they need that information. Carlos is correct. Each agency does train their officers differently, and each officer gets to go through a certain amount of training, and depending on, of course, financial need, budgets, and just availability of that officer at the time, then they may not get the same training. We are actually trying to develop a community response to training for law enforcement. It's actually in the works right now. We've got a budget set, and we're looking at offering a week-long class that all officers in Alamance County will be able to come to, and then eventually the idea is to open it up to other counties. But so that each officer will get the exact same training, and that each officer will get the training that I have as an investigator, even though they're a patrol officer who's been here 5 months. You know, at 10 years of doing this, I may know something that may be important for Carlos to know, but he's only been here 5 months. He hasn't been to the training yet. He might not have that same information. So we're working on that. We have the services available through the community for the victim. But again, it falls back on the community as a whole, everybody individually. Everybody has to take a stance. Everybody has to react. Everybody has to share the information. They have to call. They have to say what they're going to say. And they have to let everybody know that this is the only way to respond to domestic violence, is to just simply say, we are not going to take it. So, thank you.
Thank you. We have another question.
Yeah, this was kind of addressed just now a little bit, but in case you guys have anything else to add, what steps as a friend or a third party should you initially take if you find out about a case of domestic violence? If there's anything to add, this was from an audience member.
We did have a walk recently here and a candlelight vigil after, and one of the things that I reached out to the students to say is silence gives violence power. If it's being kept quiet, if you're not talking to somebody, even if your friend, if you're worried about her safety, reach out to somebody, call the crisis line. The offending parties depend on all of us keeping quiet. That's that. They want their victim to keep quiet, and they want the neighbors to keep quiet. It's none of your business, and as long as we're quiet and continue to be silent, they're going to continue to offend. So the most powerful thing you can do is just use your voice and speak out and contact law enforcement if you're concerned about somebody's safety, your friend's safety. Contact us, call the crisis line, we'll get you where you need to be. As somebody who has lost some victims over the last 15 plus years, that can save lives. It really can.
Yeah, there are call-in lines at the police department, and you can call in and you can leave an anonymous tip. At least that will bring it to the attention of law enforcement where they can maybe check into something. The problem with anonymous tips is it may be that law enforcement can check in on something, don't see anything, can't unearth anything, and that's where it begins and that's where it ends, is with the tip. On the other hand, if you see something and it appears to be violent, it appears to be dangerous, whatever, and you can find the courage to make that phone call, what that does is it starts something in motion. The thing that you don't want to do is to try to insert yourself between the perpetrator and the victim in the case. Because more likely than not, number one, it's not going to help the victim. You may end up being harmed yourself. And it may just result in some kind of escalation of the violence. So I would encourage you not to do those types of things. Information is critical. What Mr. Rossi was saying, you know, he said you need to talk to us. Well, yes, but that's hard to do, and I think we all have to understand that that's very hard to do. If you're being abused, if you're being stalked, if you're in a relationship that's been going south for a long time, it's very, very difficult to talk to your best friend about it, much less talking to a stranger about it. But I do think that that's one of the things that all of us who have worked in various facets of services or the criminal justice system or anything else have to be aware of, to pick up on what Ms. Matherly said a while ago. You know, officers may have, and she picked the number 65 cases on the desk. That's really not a stretch. They may well have that or more at any given time. But the other thing that she said is the case may be the most important thing to you. And I think that all of us have to understand that, particularly in the court system, is that to each person who is a victim, that case is the most important case to that person. So for that little period of time that is dedicated to that person's case in the courtroom on a busy court day, the DA in the courtroom has to say, this is the most important case I'm handling today. The victim advocate, that's the most important case that I'm handling today. So you have to treat each case as the most important. So what does that mean? It means they're all important.
I would just add, too, in response to that question, if it's your friend, don't give up on him or her. Don't get frustrated because you keep telling them, come on, I'll help you, let's go, and they are reluctant to do so. Most victims try to get away from these relationships 5 to 7 times before they are successful breaking the tie. And so they need their friends to stay supportive even in the face of them choosing to remain involved. So continue to be there and just say, I'm here for you when you're ready.
An additional question. Thank you.
Question I have relates to at the time that the victim is becoming a victim, at the time that they are being assaulted, is there any suggestion from the panel or from members of the audience as far as what the victim should be doing at that time? What type of response should they be coming up with then?
That's really going to be as individual as that case. Every person is different. Every relationship is different. We, as advocates, we know some things to look for that are high risk. Is he threatening to kill himself? Is he have a weapon? Has he used a weapon? Has he pointed a weapon at you? There's some things that we know to look for that say, okay, this is really, really dangerous, and we can explain that to somebody and explain those things. But the victim knows that offender better than anybody else, and she knows what's going to be his trigger. And so for what may seem like an irrational response, might have been the smartest thing that victim could have done in that moment to prevent a serious injury or homicide. So there isn't a really good answer to that. It's going to be unique to that case. Of course, we want victims to reach out. Like I said, the silence gives the violence its power. We want them to reach out to us. They want them to call law enforcement and follow up and do what they have to do to keep themselves and their children safe.
But you're still dealing with after the fact reaching out. I'm talking about when you're being beat up. What do you do then? What do you suggest?
Try to stay alive.
Yeah, honestly, try to get to it. Have a phone. Try to get to your phone and call 911. A lot of what we do, if we have a victim that's the relationship is ongoing and it's been maybe escalating, we will safety plan with them and tell them to talk to their neighbors and have code words. Have a safety plan with the kids sometimes, like this is what you need to do, and run to the neighbor and have them call 911. we will convince, explain to victims to leave a cell phone that they don't know about. We have 911 phones available for victims hidden in a bathroom. So that way, if you can get yourself to the bathroom, you can get to that 911 phone and call for help. But really, we just sit down with each individual victim and find out what the history has been and kind of safety plan with their particular case. That there is no cookie cutter. What do you do when you're being hit? Just try to, like Angela's, try to get out of the situation. Whether that means appeasing that person, a lot of times that is, telling them, I love you, I love you, I'm not going to leave you, I'm not going to call the police, because that's what's going to make them stop right now.
And to clarify, by 911 phones, you mean deactivated cell phones, they will still dial 911. What about text messaging 911? Is there some?
That's not an option right now.
Okay.
The other problem with text messaging too is
there's a record.
Well, there would be a record, but they're also, it's really hard to track an exact location of a cell phone. You can ping a cell phone and get the general area, but you can't necessarily locate the exact house, and so that makes texting a little bit more difficult. And that really isn't an option with communications right now.
So our last audience question, Sarah.
Hi, thanks so much for being here and giving us your expert opinions. If you could all possibly touch on some of the more systematic factors that contribute to domestic violence, like sexism, racism, classism.
It's gender inequality. Gender inequality, Angela touched a little bit on the media and exploitation of women. It's not the only cause, but it definitely contributes to violence, not only in our country, but across the globe. Really just male privilege and socializing our kids to recognize each other as equals is like the systemic way to stop it. And it's a lot of, again, I'm going back to that He for She program, targeting just some beliefs in our pop culture and things, rap music. I mean, there's all kinds of things that are exploited to women.
Right. Jason had mentioned to me that he might ask each one of us to say, what is the one thing we want you to take with you when you leave tonight? So this is kind of jumping ahead to what my answer was going to be to that question. So
I'm about to ask that question.
Okay, so we'll just go ahead and do that.
Yeah.
I wholeheartedly agree with what Lynn just said. To get to your other matrices of domination that you alluded to in that question, there's a whole intersectionality of reality that we all live in, right? I'm not just white, I'm not just female, I'm not just heterosexual. I'm all of those things simultaneously, and I live inside all of those realities at the same time, and each of you lives inside your own matrix of reality. So we kind of artificially separate those out to study them as scholars who try to examine this particular social phenomenon. So we know, for example, that all of the data that we have about domestic violence is understated, right, underrepresented, because most victims aren't calling. They're still in the closet, in the silence, in the darkness. But 85% are female in a heterosexual relationship, 15% are male in a heterosexual relationship. You're 3 times more likely to be victimized if you're in a lower income household. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen in an upper class family. It just might be better hidden there because they have more at stake and more to lose in the community if that word gets out. Certainly financial stress contributes to this being likely to happen, so it makes sense that it would be that much more common in a lower income household. It happens across all racial and ethnic lines. No clear prevalence one way or the other on that particular dimension. But the one that I think is most important is the gender inequality dimension. Jackson Katz talks about the reason why masculine privilege is so prevalent in our society is because it goes unexamined, right? Last week, we just had another school shooting up in Seattle, and it was another young boy who did it. And every piece of news coverage that I've seen has focused on how he was a homecoming prince and he had everything going for him, but not a single word about how it's another boy, right? We live in a society where masculinity is making it okay to act out aggressively in all different types of facets of our world. And it's embedded in the kind of questions that we ask about domestic violence. The first questions that we tend to ask is, well, why doesn't she just leave, right? I wouldn't stand for it. I wouldn't let somebody treat me that way. I would get out, right? And that's the wrong question to be asking. We're shining the light on the victim in the situation and saying, it's your problem, find a way to get out of it, right? Instead of asking, why does someone behave that way? Why is someone taking total power and total control and thinking that they can batter and abuse another human being, right? Why don't more men, because it's most of the time men, respect women in our society, right? And not respond in those ways. And we don't shine the light in that direction. So if we want to hold offenders accountable, that's what we have to start asking, right? Why do we sit back and continue to let this happen? We have to start raising our boys to react differently, right? And to respect, because there's some great examples of men out there, right? Please don't misinterpret what I'm saying, right? I bet every man in this room is a wonderful example of masculinity, right? Because he's here and he's paying attention to the conversation, right? So we need to shine the light on those examples and say, this is how to do it right, right? But we don't tend to do that. I think that's where the answer starts, is changing the question that we ask.
We have now run out of time. There are many more questions we could talk about with this. We have coffee and refreshments and a coffee clutch in this room, just the other side of that wall. So as you leave to the right, before you leave, I'd like to thank Madison Taylor and the Times-News for co-sponsoring this event with us. The second Community Connections event. The second Community Connections event will be called Alamance 2030, focus on the future of Alamance County and incorporate Burlington revitalization into our discussion. And the third will focus on hunger in the spring. Let's have a big round of applause for our panelists.